Can you all hear me? Shohini, can you hear me? Alka ji? While Shohini is getting it all sorted out, should we start with you? As everybody knows, and you know also, we are here basically for the formal launch of the book Love, Life and Drama, which is Shohini's latest book. She's a dear friend as well, and I was really looking forward to.
Yes.
So to continue, we are here for the launch of the book, as well as for a discussion on this very interesting book that Shohini has authored on a very different subject, on which not much has been written, at least in my knowledge. So I think first, I don't know how Shohini wants to proceed. Would you like to say a few words first, Shohini, and then we can move on to Alka ji? How do we do this? I'm sorry, all of you bear with us. This is a very strange.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here because, as you know, I was 8 hours at the airport and back. Alka also faced similar problems thanks to the villain Indigo.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think we're all connected because we've written about, Sangeeta, you've written brilliantly on the Devdasis. Alka's perpetually been writing on the divine feminine and Shiva and all of that, and the balance of equation between the divine masculine and feminine. And I'm very grateful to Com. Media Publishing for launching my book, for publishing my book, and I'm very happy to be in such robust company today. Thank you, Manjari, for inviting me. And we are all here thanks to technology.
Yeah.
You look as gorgeous as ever and smiling like that impishly just makes me happy looking at you. And Sangeeta, thanks for being there, but we can start with the question.
Yeah. Should we start with the question, or would Alka ji like to say a few words again before we take off?
It would be lovely to hear, Alka.
Yeah. Why don't you?
But Tejas, I just want to know, because I haven't got Shohini's latest book, I haven't seen it. What do you want me to talk about? I'm happy to talk about the creative feminine, that's not a problem. But I'm just wondering, maybe if Shohini could talk a little about her work, and then we could all jump in, or if you want me to talk about the creative feminine, I'm happy to do so.
But no, I think let's stick to the book because we don't have much time to digress.
So let's stick to the book. Yeah.
So Shohini, would you like to just quickly give a very brief synopsis of what the book is like, and then we can go from there?
Yeah, I'll do that. My book is called Love, Life and Drama, where I have spoken about the Ashtanayikas. I've spoken about the Greek influence on our Natya Shastra and Aristotle's poetics converging at certain points, with talking about the patriarchy at the same time, talking about the Devdasis, how the system was distorted by a patriarchal structure, by the moral policing of the Victorian anxiety-stricken colonists, and so on. And I've also spoken about the feminine as the Kali and Santasara in the West. I have spoken about the Kabuki theatre and Kathakali and how they barred women from coming on stage because they were kind of considered too sacred, which actually decodes as too threatening. And the men dancers would don on the makeup of women, of the Devis, and perform while the real women were watching from the audience, and how that has changed today. So this is basically Love, Life and Drama, the various theatrics, and how it reflects on real life, patriarchy and its role, and how we women kind of got back to owning our dreams, our economic and social agencies, and claiming back our power. So that is more or less
what it's all about the book. I'm sure you've heard her very clearly. So since Alka ji seems to not have really seen your book or even read the synopsis, let me start with the questions, and then if she wants to add something to your replies, I think that would be ideal, right? Do you agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
Okay, so since your, what I know about your book and the synopsis that you sent to me was so intriguing and so so interesting in the sense that, the kind of comparisons you've spoken about, the kind of theatrical traditions that you've spoken about. I learned a lot from that. But while I was reading the synopsis, I also sort of came up with a lot of questions in my own mind, because this is not something that you usually talk about or hear about. So I just put it down, and because these are, the questions are a little intellectual, shall we say, so I've decided to write them down. So I'll just, read them out one by one. Let's see how many we get covered. So to begin with, let me remind you about what you've written in your own book, which I'm sure you remember. But right in the beginning, you talk about the cross-pollination between the Hellenic culture and the Indian one in the wake of Alexander's invasion of India, right? And
Absolutely.
yeah, and then you say that a lot of influences came in, including on the theatrical traditions, and I do know that a lot of our sculpture was influenced by the Greek, by Greek art. So, but since Alexander couldn't really establish an empire in India, and the interaction, therefore, I think would necessarily have been a brief one. How did this confluence really come about, and was it a one-way street? Was it only Greek, like art forms that influenced us, or did they also take back something from us? So that's my first question.
Yes, thank you. Very good question. Sangeeta made me think, because Alexander was just the trailer. The real movie came later. The Indo-Greek kingdoms that followed him stuck around for centuries, not months. They minted coins, built cities. We also built, they married locally, they traded like crazy, and they built the auditoriums, shaped like the Greek amphitheaters, which were kind of dug up in Afghanistan. And they hired Indian artisans and blended cultures on the ground. So it wasn't a one-way Greek influence dump. It was a long, messy, delicious two-way marriage in the borderlands. Because also in Greece, you would often see a Zeus looking like a Shiva. There was a third eye evident, which was never there in their work. There have been a lot of Greek sculptures have also looked Buddhist, looking like Buddha, looking certain elements look like that. So it was a two-way process, and I think we fell in love with each other, because there have been other influences too, but we are not that influenced, but we loved the Greeks and the Greeks loved us because our mythology was similar. Our theatrical principles also had a lot of similarity, and we both loved the larger-than-life, surreal portrayal of divinity. And the many gods and goddesses, I think that is somehow some big chemistry also happened. So we had a lot of century-long exchange. Alka, I would love your input on this. Please.
Yeah, I was just going to ask.
So I would go a step further. I've been looking a lot now of late. We are looking at India's influence, because with this whole concept of a kind of a resurgence of nationalism, what we are seeing is a lot of going back into the wonder that was India to the wonder that is India. And there are people like Audrey Toshke and William, who have written lately 2 books which talk of the civilizational history of 5,000 years, and also going back to centers like Nalanda, going back to centers of spaces where there was a huge, the spice trade routes, for example. So what do we see? We see a lot of things coming from the West into India as well. We see a huge cache of Roman coins being found in Tamil Nadu. So obviously the Roman civilization came after the Greek civilization, and the whole influence of the Greco-Roman, which is so present particularly in our visual culture, is a living statement to the cross-cultural pollination, whether you see it in the Gupta classical period, whether you see it in the Gandhara art in particular, where you see in the Buddhist sculptures, the ushnish and the way of tying of the uh, top knot, you see the Sanghati, which is a transparent drape. All these are very strong Greco-Roman influences. Initially, our figures, if you see our sculptures from Mathura in particular, whether it's the Parakham Yaksha or the Yakshis from Mathura, they are standing in a position called Samabhanga, where the weight is distributed equally between 2 feet. But later, we see the Tribhanga coming in. Where is the Tribhanga coming in? It is coming in from the Greco-Roman influence, which came, as Shohini had said, that the marriage continued for a long time. So with the coming of Alexander, who came with his army and a whole lot of people, the intermingling, the Yamanas as they were called in India, what you see is the remains which carry on in India. You see it in dress, you see it in the fitted garments which came later, in boots which came also from Central Asia. You see that in the Kushan period. So this whole cross-cultural thing definitely comes into India through the Greeks. I'll just do a little bit more about patriarchy and then I'll hand it back to you. Well, as far as patriarchy goes, I think I may differ a little bit there, because in pre-modern India, I do not see so much patriarchy. Right up, if you look at the Kama Sutra and you look at book 6 of the Kama Sutra, which is about courtesans, you find that, and this is about the 4th century of the Christian era, you find that women had a lot of agency. Whether it was even at the Devadasis, they had a lot of agency. It was up to them. They chose who they wanted to have as patrons. It was very different to the later prostitution that happened. The agency was there with women. They were immensely noble, well-educated women. Whether you look at the representation of Rasadevi in Meera Nair's book, or you look, as I said, of these Amrapali, of Vaishali, you see all these women, they were very, very powerful women. And I don't think it was that kind of patriarchy. Yes, power play was always there, which is who is the more dominant. And I think the power play came from politics and economic empowerment. It was only much later in the medieval period, and then it was strengthened by the Victorian prudery, that patriarchy became to its top level. Even in many of the Hindu medieval paintings that you will see, whether it is the Chauru Panchisika or the Laura Chanda, you see women with great agency, the kind of clothing they wear, the coquettishness of feminine empowerment. Of course, there was, and in modern times, patriarchy, in the so-called times of today, contemporary women like us, all of us are women on the panel, will still insist that it is still a gendered world, even though feminism is at its best. When we go out to work, we are asked, why do we need to earn money? But does anybody ask that question to a man? So what I would say is that in some ways in India, from pre-modern to contemporary, patriarchy has reared its ugly head, even though the legal systems are giving equality, but in social spaces, I think patriarchy still rules.
Thank you, Alka ji, for sort of corroborating what Shohini says in a book about Devdasis. And as you know, Shohini, I'm sure Alka ji doesn't know, but my latest book, Devdasi, it's a historical fantasy in which I have reimagined the origin of the Devdasis. And I have presented the story in terms of the essential differences between the patriarchal mindset and the feminine worldview. Um, apart from the historical reasons for the decline of this otherwise very sublime system that was set into place, centuries ago, um, are you there at all? Or has the connection? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, because I couldn't see you at all, so I was wondering what happened.
We can't see both you and Tejas. I can only see Shohini and myself.
Well, that's, yeah, well, anyway. So as I was saying, I have, imagined the book as a construct of a direct contrast between the feminine worldview and the patriarchal mindset, which is, the first is creative, abundant, and the second one is very rigid and hierarchical. So, and both of you have said that, have said certain things that support that my concept of this whole thing. So I wanted to ask you, Shohini, that while I'm fully in accord with all these historical reasons, like the Mughals, turning the Devdasis into court dancers first, and then the British coming and doing even worse, and sort of equating them with prostitutes, and therefore leaving them with no other option but that of, because with the withdrawal of state support and everything, they were reduced to penury and therefore had to sort of take up prostitution as the only way to survive. So I wanted to ask you if you also agree with my proposition in my book that the prevailing patriarchy also corrupted the spiritual concept behind the creation of the Devdasi system, apart from the historical factors.
Absolutely. I completely agree that it wasn't, what happened was not an accidental decline. It is an example of patriarchal re-engineering. And as long as they held artistic authority, ritual agency, and economic independence, patriarchy viewed the system as something that they needed to correct and come back in. So their spiritual role was reframed completely as moral vulnerability. Their economic autonomy was systematically chipped away, and their ritual status was replaced with social stigma. So by the time the colonial morality stepped in with their Victorian anxieties, the structure had already been hollowed out. The colonial state simply added legal endorsement to a collapse that patriarchy had been preparing for generations. So, and their spiritual independence and their spiritual authority was threatened by distorting their roles. They're distorting their roles and activities. And when you're kind of penurious and pushed out of what you've done best all your life and your authority taken away, then to sustain, you could do anything. I mean, then prostitution is an end product of that. And some of them prostituted themselves. Most of the Devdasis died
of poverty.
Poverty, and they had all kinds of diseases. Some became blind, and they were just socially outcast. And all their powers being stripped away, and no state care too, no state support. So it was something which was completely re-engineered by patriarchy and then polished off by two colonizations.
Right, absolutely. So since Alka ji has already expressed her views on both these subjects, we'll move on to another question. You talk about the Ashtanayikas, as you just mentioned in your book also. And their description in the Natya Shastra, representing women's behavior in different emotional and relationship contexts, right? And you also say that these prototypes continue to be an integral part of women today. But given how rapidly socio-economic roles of women have been changing in the 20th century and the 21st century, do you think that the Ashtanayikas are being slowly, if not erased, then at least amended in the feminine psyche, limiting our emotional compass in many ways? Do you agree with that? And if so, how is that impacting the female narrative in literature and the visual arts as well as cinema?
Absolutely. The Ashtanayikas were there. It's been rebooted and re-engineered today by the women of today, like you, Alka, me. We've re-engineered these things. We've like to, take control and own our narratives. And they were not meek, mythic maidens, but ancient India's sharpest emotional economists. 8 archetypes who understood love as strategy, risk, labor, and rebellion. The Vasak Sajja didn't just dress up. She staged desire like a premiere night, reposted as curated sensuality and mood lighting on Instagram. And at that time, maybe she was waiting for her lover all dressed up. Today, she might be waiting for her startup to take off.
Yeah.
The Khandita mastered the righteous fury long before feminism had a name. But now she weaponizes receipts, timestamps, and a withering we need to talk. She would be just preparing to kind of vent herself on our raging TED Talks. The Abhisarika once crossed forests and thunderstorms for love. Today she braves social judgment on safe streets and surge pricing because wanting something openly is still an act of courage. The Vipralabdha eternally stood up, has evolved into a modern ghosted woman, dignified, may have published 7 of her books and is a raging author. The Prashita Bhartika turned separation into a novel. Her contemporary self can do long distance video calls if she wants to. And deals with her loneliness in a different way. And she has developed existential issues which are being which is helping her grow even more. The Swadhina Bhartika had a lover who revolved around her and also proves that female pleasure was once canon before it became controversial. And she might be wanting her space and developing her boundaries even more so that she feels stalked at times. So I think all these women were real. Though we like to ignore their presence and push them under the carpet, they were real in their emotions, which were desire, anger, venting their frustration and all that. And now they have just evolved differently. And though we use them as reference point in movies and theaters, they have completely rebooted and taken over differently. And Wi-Fi happened to them. Social and economic agencies happened to them. So the same 8 women with the same emotional intelligence, only today's society calls them too much instead of calling them the classics. So they're all there, and I think our aesthetics didn't judge women by their virginity or virtues. They were judged by the emotional intelligence. That's the way I look at it.
So essentially what you're saying is that the context has changed, but the Ashtanayikas are still very much there as a part of all of us, expressed in a different way, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's all about relationship status. I mean, what is today emojis and algorithms? Indian aesthetics classified women differently about how real they were and how real their emotions were. So that's what I think, yes.
Anything you'd like to add, Alkaji, to that?
No, I think Shohini has brought in her own personal take, which is very interesting, and she has talked of it because she has charted her own territory very well, and she's all the Naika. She's an Ashtanayika in one composite persona. So that
I agree with that.
so that's wonderful. But what I think is that what we are talking of are timeless virtues or non-virtues, and also the fact that these are universal emotions, and the emotive quality, because she used the word emotional intelligence and EQ. This is, as long as we are sentient human beings, nature remains similar across borders, across geographies, across continents, across communities. These are issues which confront any woman depending in which ecosystem she is placed. So if she is in penury, she may not be able to be a Swadhin Patika or Abhisarika. It all depends which context she is in, and I think bringing or Shohini probably in some ways I think has been a trifle privileged because she is able to, like all of us, chart out her territory. But what I see around me are still a lot of penurious women, the women which Shohini mentioned, that they died in abject poverty, they had diseases, it's still happening, it's still existing. So, in our country, where there is so much of unequal wealth distribution, the Naikas also, as she rightly said, that not only are they living, but they also have the same challenges which they had so many years ago.
Right. Yeah, I think we'd all agree with that. And I think we have time for just maybe one or two more questions. So I'll just hurry on with. I have a lot of questions, but I think I'll just select just one or two out of them. So the next thing I'd like to ask you, Shohini, is that you've drawn some very interesting parallels between the Indian and the Japanese theatrical traditions as well. And you've particularly spoken about Kathakali and in India and Kabuki in Japan. And you've explained in your book why all Kabuki artists are men, because there was apparently this lady who started performing in public, and her performances were regarded as too lewd for public consumption, and therefore women were banned from the Kabuki system, and it was only men who would take on the roles and do whatever. But we see the same thing in Kathakali traditionally, right? Because it was men who played all roles, whether it was masculine or feminine. It was just that the mask differed and the costumes differed. So my question is that Japan was probably, has always been a far more restrictive culture than the Indian one, because first of all they speak the same language. It's a small country, and they're far more uniform in the way they approach the world. Whereas our traditional culture has always been much broader and much more accepting of various things and all that.
Yes.
So I would say that ours has always been a far more mature and adult culture, which has accepted a lot of things which, especially, the Judeo-Christian cultures probably found unacceptable. So why would you say that women were banned from the theatre in India as well? What was the reason why women were told not to perform roles that belonged to women, and men were asked to take on those roles and perform on the Kathakali stage? Why did that happen in India? Is there a story? Is there an explanation? I'd really like to know that.
Yes, thank you, Sangeeta. See, there was patriarchy in Face Paint too, and patriarchy is the sole villain in this piece. Because Kerala worshipped goddesses but barred actual women from performing on stage.
Yeah.
Playing goddesses, claiming that they were too sacred, which was, the code for too threatening. So men played every Devi, while the real women were left applauding from outside. And centuries later, women finally walked in and proved that the boys were just gatekeeping with better makeup. So they just found the women too real, too powerful, too threatening, and their poise was kind of disturbed. It was just that insecurity. So Kathakali barred its women from playing themselves and would rather hire men with more makeup to play the woman without going over the top, without being too powerful. So it was with controlled femininity that they thought only the masculine could portray with makeup. It was just as ridiculous as that.
Okay, that's a simple explanation for something which has over the years become very complicated, in a
Yes.
socio-cultural context. So I think we should be winding up. So I'll ask you just one more question, which has really intrigued me, and I'd like your response to that. See, you talk about the Brahmanization of the Shringar Ras in the Indian theatre, right? And considering that even up to the 13th century, spirituality and eroticism went hand in hand in India. Like, look at the temples in Khajuraho, in Konark. And so it was nothing to be embarrassed about or ashamed about. It was just a part of divinity in so many ways, right? So, what would you say brought about the squeamish prudishness that reduced, as you quote, exciting Shringar to boring bhakti, right? So, was it the Islamic rule or Victorian prudery that altered the mindset of a liberal, mature civilization and turned it bland and conservative? And I would just like to mention a very small incident that I discovered. Somebody told me about it. Apparently, after we attained freedom, there was a very serious, attempt to get a law passed in Parliament to break down the Khajuraho temples, because it was said that these are just too lewd and they are too sexual, and these temples do not belong in our spiritual culture or whatever. So fortunately, better sense prevailed, and that did not happen. But it was a shocking, statement for anybody to have made, and for me to hear that, I was like, seriously? I mean, and they said yes, it was a very serious attempt. So, like, given what happened, like we were such a liberal, such a mature civilization. What happened to, as you quoted, to reduce exciting Shringar to boring bhakti? What happened?
See, Sangeeta, India didn't really lose its sensuality. It got colonized twice. First by courts that got very nervous about public desire. Then by the Victorians who brought, they thought that a bare ankle was Armageddon. Between moral policing and imperial pearl clutching, a civilization that built the Khajuraho, that had written the Kama Sutra, ended up acting like desire needed a permission slip. Where you have the Kumar Sambhava and the Kama Sutra and so many others, women needed to be stripped of their sexuality, they couldn't own their sexuality, and the desire, the love, the languor, and dedication and devotion was entrusted upon them. And you have the bhakti, Meera singing her devotion to Krishna in a very chaste, sexless manner, if I may say so. So that is what also patriarchy decided, that women, middle class women, upper middle class women, where education was happening, had to be chaste to be respectable and dignified.
Right.
So that is what happened, and the movement from Shringar to Bhakti, they tried to kill the sexy.
Such a pity, but well, I guess that's how it is. So I think we've run out of time for this session, but we can ask.
We'll be having the book launch now, Sohini's book launch.
Who's going to do the...
Thank you.
Yes, we are all ready.
Okay, there you are. Come, please.
So may I invite Leena Prabhu and Dr. Manjari Prabhu up on stage?
Yes.
We are missing you a lot, Sohini and Dr. Alka.
Can you see us, Shoaib?
Yes, I can see you in full glory.
We can.
Beautiful stage that feels like home, and
Will you see it?
It's such a pity you can't be here.
Alka, can you see the book?
Yes, I'm so sad that I'm not there.
I know.
I'm there and yet not there.
Don't worry, I'm representing you.
Thank you.
I know.
thank you so much.
Congratulations, Sohini. Congratulations.
Thank you so very much, and thank you all of you for being here. Yes, absolutely.
So, congratulations from the whole audience to you, Sohini. And this book has been published by Comdot Media. So,
I'm standing here. That's she's from that media public.
I wanted Leena to say a few words.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
No?
Can we ask the audience in case they have one or two questions that she may answer?
Yes, sure.
Do we still have 5 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you, Leena. Thank you, Dr. Manjari.
So, from the audience, you've heard the whole discussion. Anything you'd like to ask Alka ji or Shoini? Please.
Yeah, my name is Satish. So, my question is to Sohini. See, you have told us that patriarchy didn't exist sometime before in this country, but in the past few years we have seen a lot of patriarchy. So, I wanted to ask you, what are the solutions? I mean, we say that probably at a younger age, boys should be educated so that they do not indulge in eve teasing and they give respect to women and all. What is your solution? How do we sort of eradicate patriarchy from India?
Yes, Satishji, thank you for your question. But patriarchy is exercised by not only men but a lot of women. In my life, I have seen sometimes women are women's worst enemies too. And Alka would agree with me. Even this may be politically incorrect to say, but I speak from my experience, so it is what it is. And I think overall empathy helps. You know, because rights of women is not very different from human rights. It's kind of let live and let live. Don't disturb. Don't help build us up. We can fight for ourselves well enough, but don't put impediments, extra impediments in our path. So an equality of rights and empathy is all that is needed to be taught to men and women alike. Because a lot of men can be very supportive towards women also. So men are not the villain in patriarchy. It is a system.
And I think mothers have that onus of teaching their sons the right values.
Absolutely, but while they deal with their husband right also, in the sense that mothers and fathers equally, I would think, you know.
Hello, my name is Nishraya. Ma'am, you mentioned that the journey from Shringar to Bhakti, but I am a performing arts student, and what I have learnt is that the Shringar is very different from Bhakti. The transition, I don't know how to explain it, but there are 9 different ras, and they all of them have their each of them have their own role. So can you explain that in more detail?
Yes, in the rasas are basically India's or Sanskrit poetry's mood board. This is the emotional aura. And Shringar is about spring, it can be about music, happiness, youth, but love, languor, all of it, and the complete package of love also has languor, lust, desire, all of it. And Shringar's wings were clipped and it was made like one-dimensional love as in devotion. So that is what happened with a lot of prudish, patriarchal moral policing. And you didn't have a Radha anymore waiting for Krishna and love and languor. That was not spoken about so much. But what happened was the Bhakti Rasa was emphasized upon, where Mirabai is pining for Krishna for oneness with the God. So we all pretended that the actual nuances of love and of female desire were all pushed under the carpet. So that is what I was talking about. It's all there, but we are pretending, you know, that it doesn't exist. And shift the emphasis onto the Bhakti Rasa from Shringar.
So it's a shift in emphasis. It's not.
And pretending as if, you know, the complete picture of love and desire for a woman does not exist. Desire has been clipped out of love.
So it just remains for me to say thank you to the panelists, to Sohini, who is the author of this wonderful, wonderful book, which explores concepts that many of us have probably not even thought about. And she gives it, its place in history, in cultural dimensions and literary conventions. I think it'll be very interesting for everyone to read this book and see what it's all about. And thank you, Alka ji, for taking the time to be with us today and to give us your perspective on so many things, including Devdasi is my favorite topic as of now because of my own book, and patriarchy and the various things that are, a part of this whole narrative of love and life and, whatever Shoni has spoken about, theatrical conventions, etc. So I'd like to thank both of you tremendously, and Well, sorry you couldn't be here. It would have been so much more interesting if you could have been sitting here on stage with me, but at least technology has made it possible, right? And thank you, the audience.